Hey everybody, this is Dan the Chess Enthusiast, and this is my Schallop Defense video. For today's game, we have the father of the Soviet chess school, Mikhail Chigorin, playing against a German grandmaster named Karl Pitschel as black. The game was played in 1881, and Pitschel here obviously employs the Schallop Defense, which is why I chose this game. And I also chose the game because, as I mentioned in my video in the Schallop, only recently attacking lines have been open against black in the Schallop Defense. But Chigorin, being one of the greats of classical chess, actually found a really great line nearly a century earlier. So with that little introduction, let's get started. The game obviously gets into the King's Gambit accepted here, the knight out to f3, and then the Schallop defense, knight out to f6. From here, white pushes the pawn and kicks the knight out to h5. From here we have the bishop to e2, and from here the move order is a little different. We still get into the staple position, but from here actually black slides the rook over to the g file right away. White pushes the pawn into the center. Black pushes its own pawn into the center. White castles, and then here we have g5. So this position is actually the end of the main line for the Schallop defense, which we covered in the last video. It's just that the move order was a little different. From here, the game continues with white putting the queen on d3, and this is putting a lot of pressure on the h7 pawn. Now, black kind of made its first misstep in the game and decided to simply move the pawn to h6, which does put the pawn out of harm's way for the time being, but it still allows the queen to come to h7 anyway. And there's actually no real good way to dislodge that queen. In the game, what was played was rook down to g6, because the rook is defended, and it also defends the pawn on h6. The problem with this position, though, is that the queen is now very deeply embedded in black's camp, and as we'll see for almost the entire game, black is not going to be able to dislodge this queen. It's going to be a really big thorn in black's side, putting a lot of pressure on the kingside position for black. I think if we go back here, a better move would have been simply to immediately play the rook down to g6, because that would have blocked the queen's influence. The rook would have been protected. It just would have been a much better position for black to play. But, as I said, that's not what was played. Instead, we wound up in this position. And from here, the play continued with white attacking the rook with bishop to d3. Now, black saves the rook by putting it on to b6, and what this is doing is putting a lot of pressure on the b2 pawn, which means that white is not going to be able to develop the bishop on c1 right away without losing that pawn on b2. So to immediately alleviate that pressure, white simply plays pawn to b3, and now the pawn is protected, and white can continue with development. Now, here black made another curious move. Black decided to play the rook over to e6, and I'm not entirely sure why black did this. I think actually, and the computer agrees with me, the computer found a better move in this position. And that move is, instead of moving the rook, which is actually under no immediate threat or danger at the moment, simply developing another piece and playing the bishop out to g4. According to the computer, the moves that followed look like this, basically. Fianchettoing the bishop onto b2, black develops the knight to c6. We have knight on b to d2 from white. The knight can come into b4, attacking the bishop. White can trade off those light square bishops, and this is just obviously a much more active position for black. Black is not really lagging that far in development. It's lagging a little bit, but not too badly. It does have some really active, nice pieces in the position, whereas if we look at this position here, after the rook moves to e6, the rook has been moved now several times. Black really hasn't developed any of its other pieces. And, it's just, I think it would have been better if black had instead decided to develop, as I just discussed, the bishop out to g4. So in this position, what white decided to do was play the rook to f5, which is not a bad move. It's attacking the rook, making it move yet again, kind of forcing black to give up yet another tempo. But actually, according to the computer, there was a much better move that Chigorin actually missed. That move is if in this position white plays the queen to h8. This is going to result in a very, very messy position for black. For example, you can have the pawn down to g4, but from here the bishop can develop to a3. With those two pieces converging on the f8 square, checkmate is to follow. So to prevent this, black must play knight out to d7, and then from here you can have the bishop play to f5. Black captures the knight on f3, and then white recaptures with the rook on f3. And this position is really, really cramped and very dangerous for black. You have these pieces converging on the f8 square, and the only piece that's protecting that square besides the king is the knight on d7. As a result of this, the rook on e6 is actually pinned, because if the rook moves anywhere, let's just say the rook moves to a6, you have the bishop capture the knight, and then regardless of the recapture, let's just say the queen plays out to d7 and captures the bishop. Here we have, queen to f8, and that's checkmate. In fact, in this position, the only way for black to prevent the checkmate would be to put the queen onto e7, after which the queen would be captured, and then the game would surely be lost shortly after that. So this position right here is what would have resulted had Chigorin actually played the move. If we go back here, instead of bishop out to f5 attacking the rook, if Chigorin had played queen out to h8. That's the computer line. But again, that's not what was played. We have the bishop playing out to f5 attacking the rook. The rook now plays over to the a file to a6. White takes the chance to immediately swap off the light square bishops. Black recaptures, and then we have the knight developing to c3, which is putting pressure on black's center. So to defend, black plays again queen back to d8. From here, white develops a piece by playing the bishop out to d2, and then after black again puts the rook back onto the e file, white actually lays out a really nice sacrifice and captures the pawn on d5. Now, in this position, if black captures the knight with the queen on d5, what you can see here is that white is actually going to be able to mobilize its pawns, gain a couple of tempos. After the bishop comes out and hits the check on c5, the king simply moves over to h1 and is out of danger. The rook is saved, the bishop is attacked again, and now black, the best move here is to try to trade off the dark square bishops, but instead of reacting to that immediately, white can push the pawn again, this time to e6. From here, the best defense is going to be for black to play the queen out to f6, but even this is going to be too little too late. The queen now for white can go to g7, hit a check, and after the king saves itself by going to e7, white can actually just capture the bishop on e3, because if pawn recaptures on e3, you can pause the video if you want to and see if you can find the best move for white in this position. It's a really good knockout move. I'm just going to show it right now. The move for white in this position is simply going to be knight to e5. This move is really powerful because the queen is obviously hit, so the queen's going to have to move, except that if the queen moves anywhere, it's either going to be lost anyway or the game is going to be over. Because what can happen is that if the queen captures the knight on e5, then the rook hits the check on f7, and after the king falls back to d6, queen out to f8 is actually checkmate. Alternatively, if we go back, if in this position black opts for some sort of a queen trade, that's not going to work either, because after the rook plays to f7, again hitting a check, there goes the queen. And this is obviously just a lost position for black. That results from if in this position the queen captures the knight on d5. However, Pitschel actually saw that, he must have seen that, and that's why he did not play that move. Instead, Pitschel played c6, kicking the knight off of that square. So from here, the knight plays to f6, hitting the check. The knight captures, the pawn recaptures, and then the queen comes out to f6. From here, the rook slides over, gets into the action, rook on a to e1, hitting that rook down. The knight develops to d7, which is putting another defender on the queen. From here, the rook is traded off, and the pawn recaptures onto e6. The bishop in this position is going to a5, which is trying to prevent the black king from castling and getting out of danger. But from here, black simply has to push the pawn to b6, and the bishop is kicked back now to c3. Now, in this position, for some reason, black opted for the move queen to e7, which is trying to stimulate some sort of queen exchange. But actually, if we go back here, the best move in this position for black actually would have been simply to castle, because that gets the king out of danger. After black castles in this position, the resulting line is that the queen can come down to e4, which is putting pressure on the pawn on c6. The king can play to c6 to protect that pawn. You have rook over to e1, pawn down to g4, attacking the knight. The knight saves itself by going to d2, bishop out to g7. From here, the queen can capture the pawn on e6, and after the queens are exchanged off, the pawn pushes to h5, and this is actually almost a dead equal position. This position right here obviously is much better for black than the position that resulted from the move here, queen to e7, because what happens in the game is that instead of Chigorin accepting the queen sacrifice, the queen exchange, the queen simply hits a check on g6, and now black has to move the king and is no longer able to castle, so the king is stuck out in the middle of the board for the rest of the game. Play continues with the rook playing over to e1, putting pressure on that pawn on e6. The queen now goes to f6, desperately trying to alleviate the pressure. Here, Chigorin actually accepts the queen exchange, but then is able to get the rook onto e6. Anyway, from here, it's over pretty quickly. The knight plays to d5, which is hitting white's bishop there on c3, but instead of reacting to that immediately, white simply captures yet another pawn on c6, and you'll notice that the rook is actually protecting the bishop on c3. From here, the king can play to d7, attacking that rook, but after we have knight to e5, which is attacking the king and protecting the rook, the king goes over to e7. From here, now white saves the bishop by pulling it back to b2, and black, desperate for any sort of counterplay, just trying to alleviate the pain that it knows is coming, plays bishop out to g7, I think with the idea of swapping off another attacking piece for white, but it's too little too late, because after the bishop hits the check on a3, the king falls back to e8, and from here, rook over to e6 actually forces black to resign. And the reason black resigns is because in this move, the only safe square that the king has is d8, and after that, there goes the knight there on d5. And black is just down material. It has a really crummy position. The king is out in the middle of the board. White's king is completely safe. I think that's why in this position, black actually just resigned. So that was the game. I thought it was a pretty good game played by Chigorin, and the King's Gambit accepted against the Schallop Defense. I think I mentioned before that I actually really enjoy going over games from classical players like Chigorin and Morphy and all those guys. And Chigorin is actually definitely one of the best players from the classical period of chess, which is why I always enjoy going over his games, and I hope you enjoy watching them as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Questions and comments are certainly welcome, and as always, there's the invitation to play online. Thanks for watching. Bye.